A note from the author. This video is about the USS Springer, SS-414, and my father's war experiences. It is divided into 6 sections. This note, my father's Navy history, the USS Springer's specifications, and the Springer's 3 war patrols. My father never talked about his experiences in World War II until the late 90s. So I started to record his stories and put together a small book for our family. In doing research, I contacted the curator at the time for the Bowfin Submarine Museum in Honolulu, Hawaii. She was gracious enough to mail me copies of the original patrol reports from the USS Springer, SS-414. They helped to validate the stories that my father told me. I also constructed a website that is almost 25 years old. I can't update it due to the software that was used to create it is very much outdated. But there you can find the same information along with a few more stories and also a cruise list. The web address is finaltrim.tripod.com. I hope that this information will be a remembrance to what God has accomplished through this country. Now, putting aside the industrial might of the United States in World War II, it was God who triumphed through the men and women who put their lives on the line so that this country would prosper. During the months in the year 1998 when I did the research and completed this, my father who passed away in 2001 and I had been drawn into a deeper relationship. I will always remember him for the man he was, in Christ, and how mightily God has used him. This publication is a testimony of the greatness of our God, and how he worked through the men and women who fought and died, standing up for the Lord Jesus Christ and what they believed in, freedom. Service History of Motor Machinist Mate 2nd Class, Andrew Stalma Jr. Andrew Stalma joined the Navy in June of 1942. The Navy sent him to boot camp at Newport, Rhode Island for the usual 6 weeks. Upon leaving boot camp as an apprentice seaman, Andy was assigned to Squad VR-3, a DC-3 Air Transport Squadron stationed at Kansas City Naval Air Base. On November 1, 1942, he was promoted to Seaman 2nd Class while on a DC-3 refueling detail. Because the winters in the Kansas City area were very harsh, Andy decided it was time for a transfer. He said, "Part of our job was to warm the planes up in the winter and it was really cold there. We heard strong rumors that the squad was moving out to Alaska soon. I thought, man, if it is cold here, what is it going to be like in Alaska?" The only transfer I could get was submarine school, so I took it. The transfer went through, and they sent him to submarine school at New London, Connecticut on January 16, 1943. While attending sub school, he chose a field of expertise in diesel mechanics. On May 15, 1943, 2 days before graduating from diesel school, they promoted Andy to Fireman 3rd Class. They transferred him to Key West, Florida, where he was stationed on the USS R4, SS-81, training other men who were foreign naval officers. Many heroic deeds have gone unnoticed during World War II. Andrew Stalma had this particular experience while stationed at Key West, aboard the USS R4. One of the most memorable things that happened to me in Key West was in the engine room on the R4. The airboats were smaller vessels which had only 2 engines. One on the port and one on the starboard side. Near the port engine was a large electrical panel which contained controls and gauges. One day, as we were coming back from a training exercise, a rather nasty short developed in the electrical panel which caused it to catch fire. I was just an oiler at the time, and my job was to throw out the clutches when we went on battery power, and then shut off the water valves. It was the throttleman's job to start and stop the engines whenever needed. At the time of the fire, I was in the engine room by myself. The throttlemen had both the engines running because we were on our way into port after having exercises all day. When the panel burst into flames, I hollered toward the after battery compartment, "Fire in the engine room." Then I shut the engines down, ran back, threw the clutches out, and shut the valves off myself. Next, grabbing a fire extinguisher, I put the fire out. Breathing in the engine room became difficult because of the CO2 from the fire extinguisher. I went into the battery compartment and saw that the others had the aft hatch open and had climbed out. I went up the ladder through the hatch and everyone else was topside. I couldn't figure out why nobody came to help me. I guess it was because the R-12, SS-89 had been lost not too long before that, and the men worried that the same fate awaited us. The captain on the R-12 had just prepared to let another officer take over the watch. The only ones that were topside were the captain, another officer, a quartermaster and 2 lookouts. The R-12 sank all too fast, and no one other than the men topside made it off her. At first, no one knew what had happened to the R-12 when she went down. Later, we learned that as the captain was about to turn over the watch to the other officer, the collision alarm sounded below. Whatever happened caused the forward battery compartment to flood, and the captain gave the order to blow the main ballast and close the hatches. It all happened so quick that in a matter of 15 seconds the R-12 disappeared beneath the sea. I figured they may have thought that one of the outer torpedo doors was shut when it really wasn't. When they opened the hatch on the tube, it would have started to flood the boat. All hands below, a total of 42 men, were lost in 600 feet of water. They pronounced the cause of the sinking unknown. It may have been that all the men went topside on the R-4 when the fire started, figuring that it would sink also. Andrew was promoted 3 more times while stationed on the R-4. Fireman Second Class, on October 1, 1943, Fireman First Class on December 11, 1943, and Motor Machinist Mate Third Class on May 1, 1944. He was stationed at Key West on the R-4 for about 1 year, and was then transferred to the SS-414, USS Springer, where he completed 3 successful war patrols. On November 1, 1945, while on the Springer, they promoted him to Motor Machinist Mate Second Class. After the war, when they decommissioned the Springer, he was transferred to the SS-319, Becuna in January of 1946. He was only on the Becuna a few months when his father passed away. They gave him leave to go home to the funeral, and when he returned, the Becuna had already left port. They transferred him to the SS-414, Sea Dog on April 9, 1946, where he spent the next 2 years of his life. Before being discharged, he also spent a small amount of time on the SS-334, Cabazon. He was discharged at the United States Naval Base at Alameda, California, with many memories and proudly sporting the following medals and ribbons. Submarine Combat Insignia with 3 stars. Good Conduct Medal. World War II Victory Medal. Navy Occupation Medal. China Service Medal. Japanese Occupation Ribbon. Asiatic Pacific Ribbon. And American Area Ribbon. Truthfulness, the final test of a man. Believe in and trust the Navy. Splendid men have made it what it is. Do all you can to keep it as good as it is, and make it even better. From the Blue Jacket Manual, 1940, 10th edition, page 5. Technical specifications of the USS Springer, SS-414, as related to her configuration during World War II. The blueprints shown are from the USS Threadfin, SS-410, after her extensive refit in 1952. Class: Balao. Length: 311 feet 8 inches. Beam: 27 feet 3 inches. Displacement surfaced: 1,526 tons. Displacement submerged: 2,424 tons. Draft: 15 feet 3 inches. Pressure hull: 7/8 high tensile steel, known as a thick-skinned boat. Complement: 10 officers and 70 enlisted men. Torpedo tubes: 10, 6 forward and 4 aft. Torpedo load: 24, 16 forward and 8 aft. Torpedo types carried: Mark 14, Mark 18, Mark 23, and Mark 27 QD. A newer, smaller acoustic homing torpedo used against anti-submarine warfare surface targets. Deck guns: 2 5-inch 25 caliber web mount deck guns, with a range of 14,000 yards. 1 40mm anti-aircraft gun. 1 20mm anti-aircraft gun. 2 50 caliber machine guns. 2 30 caliber machine guns. Power plant: 4 Fairbanks-Morse 10-cylinder opposed piston engines and 1 Fairbanks-Morse opposed piston engine auxiliary engine, with a total horsepower of 5,400. 4 Elliott main electric motors with a total horsepower of 2,740. 2 massive 126-cell batteries capable of delivering 5,320 amp-hours each. Maximum speed: 23 knots surfaced and 11 knots submerged. Surface range: 11,000 miles at 10 knots. Submerged range: 95 miles at 5 knots. Endurance: 75 days. Operating depth: according to reports, she was supposed to have been depth tested at 400 feet. Motor Machinist Mate Second Class Andrew Stalma remembered depth testing the Springer at 500 feet on her maiden voyage. There was a 100% tolerance in the design of a Balao-class sub. This would give a Balao-class sub a maximum emergency depth around 700 feet. The designers put her crush depth at around 900 feet. In any case, the original suggested depth of 400 feet came about because of the limited capacity of the trim pumps. In 1944, a new style trim pump was adopted into submarine design, which could pump 35 gallons per minute at 600 feet. This enabled the Balao-class submarines to dive deeper than the earlier designs. The Springer was known to dive down to 665 feet on one of her war patrols. In that instance, Springer's trim pumps were intentionally turned off until needed. The captain let her sink to that depth before bringing her to final trim. Motor Machinist Mate Second Class Andrew Stalma remembered it well, because during battle stations, while submerged, it was his job to man the trim pumps. The USS Springer was made up of an inner hull, outer hull, and superstructure. Springer had a cylindrical all-welded pressure hull made of 35-pound approximately 7/8 high-tensile steel. From this came the name thick-skinned boat. Springer's main weapons were her torpedoes, 2 5-inch 25 main deck guns, 1 20mm and 1 40mm anti-aircraft gun, 30 and 50 caliber machine guns, and small arms. Springer carried Mark 14 and Mark 23 steam-powered torpedoes, and Mark 18 electric torpedoes. In addition to the Mark 14, 18, and 23 torpedoes, she carried a few top-secret Mark 27s. Nicknamed Cutie for their small size. They were essentially a Mark 24 mine called Fido, modified for submarine launching as an anti-escort ship weapon. Mark 14 torpedo. Diameter: 21 inches. Length: 20.5 feet. Power: steam. Speed: 31.5 to 46 knots. Range: 4,500 yards to 9,000 yards. Explosive: 660 pounds of Torpex. Mark 18 torpedo. Diameter: 21 inches. Length: 20.41 feet. Power. Battery electric. Speed. 22 knots. Range. 4,000 yards. Explosive. 575 pounds of Torpex. Mark 23 torpedo. Essentially the same as the Mark 14, but with only one speed, 46 knots. Mark 27 Cutie passive acoustic homing torpedo. Diameter. 19 inches with 21-inch guide rails. Length. 7.5 feet. Power. Battery electric. Speed. 12 knots. Range, 5,000 yards. Explosive. 95 pounds of high blast explosive. Springer's first patrol. It was January 8, 1945, when the USS Springer departed from Mare Island. She made her way to Pearl Harbor, arriving on January 15. While at Pearl for 19 days, her crew devoted 13 of these days to training, and for the remaining 6 days the men enjoyed R&R. On February 4, 1945, she departed Pearl Harbor for Guam, with escort PC-579. While at sea, the captain conducted daily training dives, battle surfaces, gun firings, and fire control drills. 12 days later, on February 16, Springer arrived at Opera Harbor, Guam, where they moored her alongside USS Holland. Topping off in stores while taking on 55,000 gallons of fuel and 200 gallons of lube oil, the crew members were eager for some action. At 1500 hours on February 17, Springer departed Guam to patrol the Okinawa-Gunto area. She soon found out the difference between calm and stormy seas. Springer's first taste of warfare was not with the enemy, but with the sea. Springer and her crew rode out several very heavy storms at sea. Later, the communications officer had opportunity to exchange calls with batfish, burrfish, and drum, who were also in the area. Twice she set an intercept course according to reports of enemy traffic radioed from the tilefish and spikefish. As she made her way past Okinodado, enemy planes were a constant threat, forcing her to dive when the lookouts sighted aircraft overhead. On February 22, Springer dove to transit the passage undetected between Okinoirabu and Yoron. On February 28, while working her way toward Naha, the transmitter broke down while attempting to broadcast a weather report. After troubleshooting the equipment, it was determined that a switch in the master oscillator had jumped its contacts. This occurred when the friction rod clutch on the extension rod came loose. 6 hours later, when they had repaired the transmitter, she was forced to execute another dive as another plane was observed coming in fast. While below the surface, Springer experienced what they called a hot run in torpedo tube number 1. Despite careful attention to the instructions in the manual, routine maintenance for submerged torpedo tubes, the interlock had broken while testing the fusing circuits. The ready-to-fire lever had raised before the impulse air had been bled down. So, the firing key was hit while attempting to bleed down the airline. Although runtime was short, the heat generated caused the water check valve to warp so that it did not seat properly. Her able crew quickly repaired this damage. Later that day, while at periscope depth, she spotted 4 small patrol craft. They were making an anti-submarine sweep doing 5 knots at a range of 13,000 yards. The periscopes were very troublesome on this patrol. Periscope number 1 had a leaky packing gland. To prevent excessive leaking, the gland had to be tightened to the extent where rotating the scope was almost impossible. Scope number 2 was useless in high power mode until they exposed it more than 30 seconds. Also, the oil seal had been leaking on the hoisting pistons since the beginning of the patrol. Every piece of equipment on a submarine is important to its survival. The periscopes were a vital part of her capability to focus on undersea approach and attacks. The next day, March 1st, transmissions were picked up from our zoomies over Okinawa while Springer lay north of the approaches to Naha Harbor. The captain decided that the Japanese aircraft would be busy engaging our aircraft, so he kept to the surface searching for shipping leaving the harbor. Again, she was forced to make a quick dive when two planes were sighted coming in fast for a bombing run. March 2nd, Springer made radar contact with the 4 patrol craft she sighted the day before. The patrol craft were doing 5 knots, at a distance of 10,000 yards. She had to dive when a twin-engine plane came on strong. They noted that on March 3rd, it was the 5th time that a plane was sighted diving close abroad without dropping any bombs. The captain concluded that the enemy wanted Springer to believe that she was undetected, so they could reroute their convoys. On March 11th, after passing Kumashima, the lookouts sighted 2 tempting targets at a range of 22,000 yards. They later identified these ships as a Katori-type cruiser, and a large destroyer making 17.5 knots. However, a large angle on the bow at the time of contact prevented the target from being closed. At once, Springer gave chase to her first potential victim, and she cranked up her main Elliott electric motors. 2 massive 126-cell storage batteries, which could deliver 5,320 amps, powered the motors, sending 2,740 horsepower to the propellers. She could do 11 knots submerged for 1 hour, or travel 95 miles at 5 knots before the storage cells would be exhausted. After dark, the sub surfaced to follow the target. 2 float planes from a cruiser closed in at a range of 3 to 4 miles. Without delay, she was forced to dive to avoid the planes. 35 minutes later, she surfaced to give chase again. This time, being on the surface, she could bring her 4 main engines online. These Fairbanks Morse 10-cylinder diesels were one of the most reliable engine types used during the war. They could deliver 1,600 horsepower each, and with all 4 online, Springer had 5,400 horsepower available to her props. At 14:30 hours, a radar contact closed from 14 to 5 miles. Reluctantly, Springer dove again. Considering that the cruiser had at least a 40-mile lead, the captain abandoned the chase, which was very discouraging to all hands. The Springer was not without other mechanical problems on this patrol. On March 13th, she made a dive with the master Euro out of service, and it took 6.5 hours to get it back online. The next day, sound picked up a trawler that was pinging and listening with sonar, apparently on an anti-submarine patrol. As the trawler had not yet contacted Springer, the captain decided to test out a new top-secret, acoustically controlled, submarine-launched, anti-escort weapon. The torpedo was fired from tube number 7. It was designated as the Mark 27 and nicknamed Cutie because of its small size. Springer went down to 200 feet and fired the Cutie while rigging for depth charges. This was the first time the captain used one of these newer, top-secret torpedoes. The Mark 27 was a Mark 24 Fido mine modified for submarine launching. It had a speed of 12 knots with a duration of 12 minutes and 5,000 yards. Because of mechanical problems, this may have been one of Springer's most difficult attacks. Machinist Mate Andrew Stalma said this concerning the dive. "I remember once we bothered a ship on an anti-submarine sweep. The captain decided to use one of the new acoustic homing torpedoes, or cuties as they called them. We carried 3 of this type of torpedo on this run. It was this torpedo's counterpart, the Mark 24 Fido, which when dropped from our aircraft devastated Hitler's U-boat force. Being top secret, they told our Navy pilots that these were a new type of delayed action mine and to drop them into the wake of a submarine. We had spies in the area of the German submarine pens who would report when a U-boat made its way out to sea. Our planes then went hunting, dropping the Mark 24 Fidos in the wake of the U-boat. Fido would run right up to the screws and blow a hole in the aft section of the U-boat. The Mark 24s were refitted as Mark 27s so they could be fired from a submarine to combat overhead ASW attacks. They redesigned the Mark 27 to go out of the torpedo tube under its own power and then go hunting after it traveled a preset distance from the submarine. I remember rubbing my hand across one's nose and watching the rudders move around. Even so, a submarine had to rig for silent running and dive deep, in case the acoustic torpedo decided to circle back. So we dove down to 200 feet, shut everything down, and opened the outer door and it glided out. In the meantime, the captain had given an order to the electrician to slow down to almost a dead stop when trouble started. We were sinking farther as the engines slowed, and we started to take on water because of more than one problem. We usually cruised around the patrol areas for long periods with the auxiliary engine. That way we could conserve fuel and charge the batteries with the main engines. The auxiliary engine had a piping defect, in that it did not throw out enough water to keep things cool. The horizontal spray ring on the number 4 exhaust valve did not let enough water flow over the valve disc to cool the valve seat. To make matters worse, when we needed to crack the overboard bypass valve, the flow of cooling water almost stopped and the number 4 exhaust valve overheated and was damaged. As we went deeper and deeper, the pressure increased on the inboard valve because of the damaged exhaust valve. The bonnet on the inboard valve ruptured where it was bolted on, and a 4-inch stream of water started to spray out. Also, at that time, a forward trim tank vent valve was leaking, which caused the trim tank to take on extra water. We slowly went deeper and deeper, and the first-class motor machinist mate started getting nervous. With a gleam in his eye, he looked at the water spray. Then he ran to the electrician, trying to convince him to put more speed on to bring the boat up. This happened several times, and each time the electrician would say, "We can't do that unless the captain tells us we can." He kept running back and forth saying the same thing. I thought for sure he was going to crack up. Then, to top off our excitement, the outboard plug blew out of the number 1 generator cooler when we reached a depth of 400 feet. This caused the number 1 generator to ground out at the cable terminals. When we made it down to 665 feet, the captain ordered more speed put on to keep us from sinking further, and we vacated the area. Sound picked up what may have been the torpedo hitting the target, but there was no confirmation as the target disappeared, most likely sinking quickly. At 13:30 hours they surfaced when contact was lost and ran out from land to repair the inboard and exhaust valves on number 4 engine. Springer continued patrolling the area until 6 days later, when on March 17 at 23:55 hours, they established radar contact with 3 ships at a range of 22,000 yards. They started tracking at midnight on the rear target that was on a southerly course. It seems as if the targets were using radar at intervals. All 3 targets originally were making around 15 knots, and the rear target was doing 11 knots heading toward Aguni Shinto. At 0:37 hours the other targets had moved away on a western course, and it seemed that they were easing Springer away from the main target. So Springer changed course and headed west with no contact. They headed back towards Agunishima, and 3 hours later the first target was sighted. The captain decided that it was time the Springer went into action. He gave orders to use a surface approach. Acquiring a target was no easy thing. Even with her advanced torpedo data computer TDC, plotting a target was not easy. Many variables were to account for when plotting a target. If the crew correctly calculated the computations, and the torpedo acted as expected, and if the target did not succeed in outmaneuvering the torpedo, it would intersect the target track at the moment the target arrived. You can very well see the importance of a submarine crew working together as one. Commander Kefauver maneuvered Springer into position, and after a few range and bearing observations, plus precise calculations, they fed the targeting data into the TDC. The TDC set the Euro angle in the torpedoes. At 0:03:03 hours, Springer fired 4 torpedoes from bow tubes number 1, 2, 3, and 4. They fired them in 8-second intervals with a 3/4 divergent spread at a range of 3,000 yards. Torpedo tubes number 1 and number 3 fired Mark 14 torpedoes, while tubes number 2 and number 4 fired Mark 23s. They observed number 1 torpedo running 30 degrees to the left of the track. 2 of the 4 torpedoes were right on track, and she scored her first hits of the war from tubes number 3 and number 4. With multiple explosions, the target started burning and firing twin-mounted guns at random. Nevertheless, she did not appear to be sinking. The target had been calling the beach 9,000 yards away for help, so Springer moved in close and dove at 4,500 yards. Kefauver decided to finish her off with a Mark 14, and fired torpedo tube number 5 at a range of 900 yards. The torpedo was running hot and straight, correctly on bearing, but it ran under the target. The target still was moving, doing 3/4 knots at a range of 520 yards. Springer turned, reversed course, and when at 750 yards fired 3 Mark 18s from aft tubes number 8, 9, and 10 set at 0 depth with a 3-degree divergent spread at 10-second intervals. Another explosion rocked the Springer when the fish from number 10 tube found its mark. Sound reported gurgling and breaking up noise, then 2 more explosions. Identified as the 1,500-ton transport number 18, the ship disappeared from radar. Transport number 18 was a landing craft/amphibious tank-carrying craft. At the time of her sinking, Transport 18 had a cargo of 8 Kaiten kamikaze submarine torpedoes. Springer was unaware that she had sunk such a valuable cargo. 2 days later, on March 19, Springer departed the area for Guam. She rode out another rough storm that bent the antennae mast back, sending it sagging to the deck. After temporarily repairing the mast, Springer continued on her way in the storm, arriving at Guam on March 25 at 0800. She had completed a war patrol of 50 days duration, 26 of them spent in the patrol area, covering a distance of 7,572 miles, while using 76,860 gallons of fuel. Because the patrol was considered successful, they authorized her first combat star. Second War Patrol. While Springer was being refitted in Guam by Submarine Division 82 alongside the USS Produce, her crew enjoyed 14 days of rest and play at Camp Dealey. The men returned to the ship on April 9 and commenced training again. Then on April 20, Springer was ready to strike again. She sailed in the company of the USS Trepang and the USS Raton, with Commander Kefauver commanding a wolf pack en route to the Yellow Sea area. Now this area was considered a hazardous duty area due to its vast stretches of shallow water. This was not a place for a submarine crew to play cat and mouse games with the enemy. 8 days later, on April 28, Kefauver decided to take a look at Tomei Harbor on Fukushima. He notified the Trepang and Raton of his intentions, as he planned to sail south of Fukushima so that he could cover both southern approaches. At 01:35 hours, a bearing fix placed Springer in the middle of the southeast channel, 1.3 miles east of where Kefauver expected to be. Then, at 05:15 hours, a Teretsuki-class destroyer, submarine chaser number 17, and a large transport were sighted heading out of the harbor, making 16 knots at a range of 7,500 yards. Anticipating a kill, Springer attempted to close in, but unfortunately she could not get any closer than 6,500 yards. The enemy was not taking any chances as he was hugging the coastline very closely. Around 06:24 hours, 14 explosions were heard, so Commander Kefauver, concerned with the whereabouts of Trepang, turned around and headed back out of the harbor. Later, In communicating with Trepang, it was found that when she was stationed outside of the harbor she attacked and sank the transport. Trepang dived at once as the sub-chaser spared no expense in depth charging her. Quick to act, the Trepang outmaneuvered the sub-chaser and slipped away. While Springer was heading back out of the harbor at 07:57 hours, sound picked up pinging. At 08:16 hours she sighted the returning destroyer minus the transport at a range of 8,250 yards. Captain Kefauver gave the order to move in closer and the Springer maneuvered into what the captain called a lovely position at 4,500 yards with zero angle on the bow. He decided to ease off track, but the target turned towards Springer, giving her a 10-degree angle on the bow. Commander Kefauver decided that the only solution would be a shot down the throat. At 1700 hours, the periscope was raised as Springer prepared to fire, but the target had turned again, giving them a 65-degree starboard angle. A quick change in setup was configured, and at 08:30 hours with the crew tense, Springer fired 3 of her torpedoes from a range of 1,500 yards set at 6 feet deep, and a 50-degree right Euro at the destroyer. A Mark 14, from tube number 1, a Mark 23 from number 2, and a Mark 14 from number 3. Observing the first fish hitting the aft section of the target, the captain prepared for trouble. Somehow, the target turned by either being blown around or moving towards Springer by listing heavily to port. The order was given to dive, and as the captain put it, we went deep rigging for our first shellacking. A few minutes later, after hearing only a few popping noises, she came back up for a look. The target's aft section was blown off and was bent nearly 90 degrees upward, while she went dead in the water. Motor Machinist Mate Second Class Andrew Stalma reported, "I never saw anything like it. The whole afterdeck separated from the ship. It just went vertical into the air when we hit it. The Japanese were trying in vain to patch up the damage from the torpedoes with mattresses. Then we sighted a plane circling over the target inspecting the damage. The Japanese finally realized that the effort was futile and decided to abandon ship. We saw 2 Japanese officers causally walking out of the forward hatch as if on a Sunday stroll. They were dressed to the hilt with swords and sashes. It was remarkable. One had a sash that trailed from the main deck clear down to the water's edge. They all seemed willing to fight when they didn't even have a ship left to fight with." Then the captain said, "Well, this joker, he always called the enemy joker, doesn't want to go down, so we'll give him another fish." 27 minutes later, Springer fired a Mark 14 from tube number 5 at range of 800 yards. The torpedo ran just ahead of 2 lifeboats and 1 raft and missed the ship. At 08:55 hours, a plane was sighted over the target as Springer fired a Mark 23 from tube number 6, with the result being the same as tube number 5. This one passed right under the loaded life raft, causing a flurry of excitement on the raft, scaring the pants off those Japanese. Kefauver turned Springer and opened out for a stern shot, maneuvering again into firing position. At a range of 950 yards, a Mark 14 fired from tube number 8 at the stack, hit under the number 1 turret. This eliminated the bow and 2 loaded lifeboats, leading to the demise of sub-chaser number 17. It sank vertically a minute and a half later, at a 180-degree dive angle. Sub-chaser number 17, at 167 feet 4 inches in length with a 22-foot beam and 9-foot draft, weighed 460 tons, and could do 16 knots. She sported one 72.6 mm gun, 2 13.2 mm anti-aircraft guns, and 36 depth charges. 1 plane circled during the attack but made no attempt to bomb Springer. As the captain commented, they were probably muttering their well-known "what a deplorable situation." 4 hours later, sound picked up screws and Springer observed 2 trawlers on an anti-submarine sweep. 2 planes came by, this time loaded with bombs, looking for Springer. the captain decided that since they were down since 01:35 hours for 11 hours, to let these pass without bother. So he gave the order to go deep and cleared the area, surfacing at 0200 hours, 1 hour and 15 minutes later. On April 30th, after 4 days of peace, the Springer had radar contact with 3 new targets. At 10:25 hours, the captain attempted to contact Trepang and Raton, but only Trepang answered. Pakuta was also in the area and answered, but was too far away to be of assistance. The morning was very foggy, so Kefauver decided that the thick fog would make a nice cover to slide in under. The contacts were identified as one large freighter, a destroyer, and another destroyer escort. Reports were sent to Trepang concerning the zigzag plan of the targets. Then 2 hours later, the captain took the opportunity to position the Springer right between the ships, hoping for a daring double kill, with the aft tubes firing on the destroyer and the forward tubes eliminating the freighter. Meanwhile, the Trepang had reported that she had positioned herself on the opposite flank of the targets. By 1200 hours, Springer closed to a range of 4,750 yards while obtaining a favorable firing position. As the convoy zigged, the escort was now 1,500 yards ahead of Springer, but now the tide was turned against Springer. The fog, which had been very thick, lifted quickly, leaving Springer naked, in full view of an angry destroyer escort. The destroyer escort was located at a bearing of 130 degrees relative, with 110 degrees angle on the bow. The destroyer escort wasted no time in turning toward the Springer while firing all guns. With machine gun fire raking across Springer's deck, the destroyer escort trained her large guns on Springer and commenced firing. Kefauver changed setup and fired 3 Mark 14s down the throat from tubes 8, 9, and 10 at a range of 1,000 yards and dived fast. This was primarily to bother the destroyer and possibly divert his attention for a moment while Springer dove deep. Tube number 7 was made ready with a special surprise for the escort, a Mark 27 acoustic torpedo. As she dove and rigged for silent running, the men fully knew what was coming next. 27 very close depth charges came down the pike, pounding down around her. Motor Machinist Mate Andrew Stalma reported that it seemed like twice that amount. Speakers were knocked off the bulkhead, light bulbs smashed as she shook from the force of the explosions, while valves lifted from their seats. Imagine sitting in a steel drum with a freight train passing by, and then someone pounding on the side with a sledgehammer. That is very similar to the sound of a destroyer passing overhead as depth charges exploded around a submarine. Things seemed to look bad for Springer, and the men's nerves were tested as they rode out the attack. With all the noise in the water from the depth charges, it was likely that the Mark 27 was not able to hone in on the destroyer. As Springer finally evaded the destroyer, sound reported an explosion some distance away. All was quiet, so she eased up for a look. The last explosion was a torpedo fired by the Trepang at transport number 146, which was now dead in the water. The destroyer and destroyer escort, not realizing that there were 2 subs in the area, moved to about 8 miles out searching for Springer. Trepang reported that she was moving in to finish off the target, thereby sinking it. May 1st came as Springer commenced a radar approach at 13,000 yards on 2 ships out on an anti-submarine sweep at 0:30 hours. Springer sent a message to Trepang but still couldn't contact Raton. At 02:15 hours, radar picked up another pair of ships at 6,140 yards. Springer hauled out of there on all 4 main engines and dove at 0600 hours, not knowing what she was up against. She surfaced at 0730 hours, and at 0900, SJ radar contacted something at 36,000 yards. As Springer closed to 1800 yards, the contact turned out to be 2 small fishing boats, so she headed out north. May 2nd, at 2100 hours, an SJ radar contact of 3 ships at a range of 36,000 yards was made. Then at 22:16 hours, Springer received word that Raton was busy chasing after another contact, and Trepang was too far away to be of assistance. She manned night battle stations at 23:43 hours, and at 23:51 hours, she determined the contacts to be either a destroyer or a destroyer escort with 2 small ships on its starboard bow. Springer moved into 3,310 yards, and obtained a favorable firing position. 4 torpedoes were fired from tubes 6, 5, 4, and 3. 2 Mark 23s and 2 Mark 14s, all with an 8-second firing interval for each. 1 small explosion was heard, and then 2 more heavy explosions came next. 1 torpedo hit the target's magazine, and the target blew up with such tremendous force that the Springer shook from the explosion. That ended the career of the Ojika. She was an Okuro-class escort, 258 feet 65 inches in length and 29 foot 10-inch beam with a 10-foot draft. At 940 tons, she could do 19.5 knots. She sported 3 120mm guns, 16 to 20 Type 96 25mm anti-aircraft guns, 1 8-centimeter mortar, and 120 depth charges. She was put in service on April 5, 1945 and put out of service by Springer. As Springer closed again to 3,600 yards, the remaining 2 targets were small patrol craft. Captain Kefauver considered that the enemy was now alerted, so he moved Springer northward. Meanwhile, as Springer had lost radio contact with USS Raton, it seems that Raton had her hands full. On the night of May 2nd, she had made contact with 3 targets off the Shantung Peninsula. That night, she torpedoed a loaded tanker in a surface attack, the Toru Maru. Earlier on in the day, despite gunfire from 2 Japanese escorts, Raton also sank a medium-sized cargo ship, the Rezukin Maru, in a submerged torpedo approach. The following night, May 3rd, Springer made radar contact at 60,000 yards. She commenced radar approach at 20,480 yards on ship that was on an anti-submarine sweep. Trepang reported a contact and was investigating, while Raton was farther north. Manning night battle stations, Springer closed and fired 4 torpedoes, 2 Mark 23s, and 2 Mark 14s, at 6-second intervals from tubes 6, 5, 4, and 3. 3 hits were observed on the enemy ship 2,700 yards away. These were also felt, and followed shortly by a huge underwater detonation. Meanwhile, at 23:09 hours, a huge flash on the horizon to the west was observed, followed by an underwater detonation wave. The fish from the Trepang had found their mark in a successful attack. Springer's target had capsized, but still stayed afloat, so at 23:30 hours, Springer fired a Mark 14 and Mark 23 from tubes 1 and 2 at the target, which was dead in the water. Both of these torpedoes missed. As she was circling the target, it suddenly disappeared. May 4th at 01:30 hours, Springer closed upon a large oil slick with lots of debris, while looking for survivors from Japanese coastal defense vessel number 25. The captain sent a seaman in a raft to see if there were any survivors, but all he found were some charts and 2 oars. Coastal defense vessel number 25 was a C-type patrol vessel, 221 feet 5 inches length, a 27 feet 7 inches beam, 9 feet 6 inches draft, and 745 tons, with a speed of 16.5 knots. She sported 2 120mm guns, 12 25mm anti-aircraft guns, 1 8-centimeter anti-submarine mortar, and 120 depth charges. The next evening, Springer departed the area for lifeguard duty for aircraft carrier strikes on Honshu, and also for a rendezvous with Scabbard Fish to transfer papers. On May 4th, a plane closed to 4 miles, forcing Springer to dive at 06:35 hours. She surfaced at 07:42 hours, and at 10:00 hours sighted 2 B-29s and had a not-so-friendly exchange with one of them. Motor Machinist Mate Second Class Andrew Stalma said, "On that particular patrol, a B-29 started firing on us. We had walkie-talkies to communicate with the planes, and the captain radioed to them, 'What the hell are you shooting at us for?' The plane radioed back, saying if you haven't anything important to say, keep off the air. We never did find out why they fired on us." Captain Kefauver noted in his report that the B-29s were not following the newly established procedure of remaining outside the 8-mile limit until exchange of recognition. Things were pretty routine until May 14th, when at 06:50 hours, an enemy fighter, a Zeke, was sighted coming in fast and low on the Springer's starboard beam. She dove fast and surfaced soon after, and observed a dogfight between the Japanese plane and 4 of our planes from the aircraft carrier. The Japanese plane ended up being shot down in flames down by our planes, the pilot dead. Springer picked up the dead pilot, his papers were taken, and he was tossed back into the sea. Springer had quite a bit of trouble on this patrol with the SJ radar. 6 tubes, 1 rectifier, 2 voltage regulators, a transmitter tube, and a local oscillator tube had been replaced. There were 3 spare oscillator tubes on board, with the first 2 being shorted. The third, when tried, was operational. Interestingly enough, extraordinary ranges were obtained with the SJ radar in the Yellow Sea area. The captain believed it to be due to a temperature inversion. The captain also reported that the SD radar was quite a sturdy piece of equipment, for they used it quite a bit during lifeguard duty. It could pick up a B-29 at 45 miles, and an F-6F at 35 miles, but didn't pick up that Zeke that rode the beam about 50 feet off of the water, on May 14th. That evening, the Springer departed the patrol area for Guam for refit. She arrived at Guam from her second war patrol of 29 days on May 18, 1945. She consumed 71,628 gallons of fuel and traveled a distance of 6,261 miles. At Guam, she was refitted by Submarine Division 161, alongside the USS Proteus. Another successful mission and a second combat star was authorized. Third War Patrol. For a second time, the officers and men of the Springer invaded Camp Dealey for 2 weeks. After losing a close athletic tournament, the crew returned to the boat on June 3, 1945. Motor Machinist Mate Second Class Andrew Stalma said, "We came in and went to the rest camp for 2 weeks, and a relief crew took over and they refit the sub. There were poker and crap games going on at the rest camp. Also we played different games with another ship, and we lost a tug of war. They had heavier men than we had." Lieutenant Commander J. F. Bauer relieved Commander Russell Kefauver as commanding officer. Lieutenant J. G. Gibson returned aboard as he recovered from an appendectomy. More training was commenced on June 6 and finished on June 14. The Springer was ready again for sea on June 16. At 06:30 hours, Springer departed Guam with escort DE-701, Osmus, for a third war patrol. Her orders were to proceed to Saipan for torpedoes, then to the vicinity of Tokyo Bay for offensive patrol and lifeguard duty. On the same day at 1500 hours, Springer entered Tanapang Harbor, Saipan, and was moored to the USS Orion. The next day, June 17, at 1500 hours she departed Saipan with escort LCI-322 en route to the patrol area. Commander Bauer made note of the genuine hospitality offered, saying that it would not be forgotten too soon. On the way to the patrol area, Springer exchanged calls with USS Jack and USS Pedo. She stood by in the patrol area for many B-29 strikes. Later, at 10:05 hours on June 26, they received word of a downed B-29 Albatross 11. Springer headed out to the area of the downed plane. At 10:30 hours, they observed their own B-29 cover and two other planes making bombing and strafing runs on a schooner and two split kits. The targets were burning, and the planes radioed that Springer's help was not needed. Meanwhile, Trepang had already investigated the B-29 wreckage of Albatross 11. No rafts were sighted. At 1100 hours, Springer received word of another B-29, Albatross 12, which was down south of their position. They headed out and rescued 7 men from the sea. About an hour later, the lookouts sighted another man and they pulled him out of the water. The pilot reported that 2 additional crew members had jumped, so they continued the search until dark with no results. On June 27, the Springer rendezvoused with the USS Tigrone and transferred the airmen to her. In the middle of the transfer, a radio message came in from a box kite, or rescue and search plane, that a B-29 crew, 8 Goodyears down the previous day, were floating a mere 7 miles from the Japanese seaport of Nagoya, which was about 50 miles northwest of Springer. As they had a little bet on, Springer commenced a race with the USS Trepang, who had a 5-mile head start for the downed zoomies. Upon reaching the group first with a 20,000-yard lead, the Trepang picked up all but 1 man. The Springer rescued the other man, Lieutenant Colonel Howard F. Hughes, who was on a raft. These men were from Albatross 11, which was down the previous day. Several days later, Springer rendezvoused with the USS Devilfish and transferred the zoomie. July 1, Springer experienced a problem with number 1 periscope. It seems that during the last refit at Guam, Subdivision 82 on the Produce had pulled the cylinders and pistons through misunderstanding a request. Produce did not have piston O-rings similar to that of what Springer used. So, they replaced them with obsolete types. By the time that the mistake was realized, it was too late to change them back. On July 1, during a morning routine exercise, the number 1 scope refused to raise. The port piston was functioning normally, but the starboard piston was frozen. After a few more attempts to raise the scope, it worked. When they tried to lower it, the starboard piston was frozen again. The crew ended up disconnecting the starboard piston from its yoke and lowering the scope with the port piston and block and tackle. Upon examination, they discovered that the yoke retaining ring was stripped and the piston rods were bent. July 4 came a few days later. Motor Machinist Mate 2nd Class Andrew Stalma described how the crew of the Springer celebrated the 4th of July that year. He said, "On the night of July 4th, the lookouts sighted a few mines and the captain let the crew have a little target practice. I jumped 10 feet that night as I was sleeping when they hit the first of the 4 mines with rifle fire. It sounded like it went off right underneath me." On July 9 at 10:05 hours, an enemy plane was shadowing Springer's position. They dived quick when the plane tried to sneak into attack. At 12:05 hours, Springer's cover, AB-17 and 3 fighters arrived on the scene. The fighters went after the enemy plane, made 1 pass and scored several hits. They ended up chasing him inland. During the dogfight, one of our fighters seemed to be damaged. The pilot jettisoned his bombs and dived. During the dive, the fire went out, and the pilot radioed that he was okay. It was on July 17, 1945, that Springer commenced patrolling in Kisuido, but no contacts were made. She was sighted daily by a Japanese float plane, and of course she dove immediately. The aircraft always dropped 2 depth charges to wake up the Springer in the morning. Motor Machinist Mate 2nd Class Andrew Stalma said, "Every morning I would hear 1 man say, 'Well, here comes the milkman,' and down we'd go. The same particular enemy plane came by every day at 0450 hours. We patrolled that area every day, and so did that enemy plane. I wondered why they didn't send a ship out looking for us, since the plane would have reported our position daily. About that time, our own aircraft had reported 5 or 6 ships in Tanabe Bay, so the Springer closed into the harbor to take a look. Having not sunk any ships on this patrol, the captain was anxious for a target. We had just received the message that there was a possibility of Japanese ships in the harbor. Motor Machinist Mate Second Class Andrew Stalma said, "A new captain was assigned to us on that patrol run, and he wanted a ship bad. He gave the order to go into the harbor hunting. On the way in, radar picked up something, but they couldn't tell what it was. I was in the control room at the time, and they had all the pictures of Jap ships spread out trying to figure what it was. The contact was making 4 knots, and by the time we got into the harbor it was dark. So, the captain ordered the gun crew out. When I got up there, I couldn't believe what I saw. The whole Japanese coastline was all lit up. Our planes must not have made night bombing runs then. I remember one man from the gun crew, he got nervous when he saw all the lights on the coast and said, 'Andy, let's get the hell out of here and go below.' We fired a shell near the target, and when it went off it lit up the area. But the joke was on us. It turned out to be a big gray harbor buoy that had broken loose from its moorings. We dared to go in as far as we could, but we didn't contact any ships, so we departed the area. At 1800 hours, on July 23rd, the Springer departed her station for Guam. She arrived at Guam from her 3rd war patrol on July 27th, having gone 8,461 miles, consuming 70,680 gallons of fuel, with a duration of 42 days. Springer commenced refit by Submarine Division 341 alongside the USS Fulton. This patrol was the Springer's 3rd successful war patrol, and a 3rd combat star was authorized. The crew rested again at Camp Dealey. This time they won the athletic contest before returning to the ship. On August 11th, Lieutenant Early was detached, and Lieutenant Arbelt came aboard as his relief. Springer went through another training period, and was scheduled to depart on her 4th patrol when hostilities ceased with Japan. Several days later, Lieutenant Putnam and Lieutenant J.G. Gibson were detached and sent to Japan as part of the prize crews that were taking over the Japanese submarines. The Springer ended the war with 3 combat stars, 4 ships sunk, and 9 airmen rescued. She had also destroyed 9 mines. On August 17th, Springer departed, and headed for the west coast of the United States, where she arrived at Mare Island on September 5th. Shortly after, she was attached to Mare Island Group Pacific Reserve Fleet. Springer was decommissioned on June 26, 1946, and recommissioned on September 6, 1951. She was decommissioned again on November 14, 1952, and recommissioned a 3rd time on June 26, 1953. Her final decommission was on January 23, 1961, and she was lent to the Republic of Chile and commissioned in the Chilean Navy as the SS Thompson. Her name was struck from the Navy list in September 1972, when her hulk was sold to the government of Chile as scrap.